Hello again, everyone. This is Professor Casey. Welcome back. Today we're discussing the second half of Chapter 11 from David Emory Shi's America, A Narrative History. And this deals more specifically with the life of slaves living in the South. Okay, this is something that we have built up to really from the beginning of the textbook. Okay, we've discussed this in brief kind of piecemeal portions up until now. Okay, so this is really going to delve much more deeply into what slave life was like in the South. And I put a little warning here at the very beginning that this material might be somewhat triggering. Okay, the details of certain atrocities that are committed, again, the brutality of slavery is something that cannot really be overstated. Okay, so I put warnings at the beginning of this. I'm very specific about the language I use when discussing it. I don't use any incendiary material when I can avoid it. Okay, so just all that to say, the material here is very sensitive, and I try to treat it with the respect that it deserves. So the key feature of slavery, as most people are no doubt familiar with by now, is the dehumanization aspect. Okay, black people living in the South who were part of the slave system, who were not considered free persons of color, were treated as property. Okay, they weren't treated as human beings. Okay, the closest up until now that we've gotten to them being treated as humans has been the 3/5 compromise. Remember, and it doesn't fully count them as a full human being. Right, only 3/5 of a person. And the closest parallel in treatment between slaves and something else is perhaps livestock. Okay, they're treated and bred in the same way. They are sold and bought in the same manner. And much of this has its origins in terms of the excuses that are given for why this was allowed to continue for so long, and why it was put into practice in the first place, because of a lot of race myths that began in the Enlightenment era. Okay, again, we tend to praise the Enlightenment as being kind of the beginning of greater human understanding and kind of the development of philosophy and free thought and so forth. But the Enlightenment also carries with it some very dark aspects. Okay, the concept of race as an entity is something that is actually a social construct invented during the Enlightenment period. Okay, the idea that we can somehow enter into some sort of taxonomy of sort of subcategorizations of human beings is something that again ends up having a lot of negative repercussions, and that's a very deep understatement in and of itself. Okay, this is something that again carries forward into the practices of Nazi Germany, and the race myths that we're specifically talking about here tend to go all the way back into biblical myth. Okay, when we're talking about Old Testament stories where individuals claim that a certain individual may be cursed by God or cursed by another figure in the Bible, and that somehow their descendants, right, will forever remain in a position to toil in the fields, or will forever be placed in a condition of slavery. Okay, this was the excuse that was presented at the time, and something that again carried forward all the way through medieval times in many cases. Okay, so when you have a slave owner during this time period who starts examining the condition of the slaves under their care, quite often this would be their go-to excuse, right? These are people who are perhaps the descendants of Cain, the first murderer, or perhaps the descendants of Ham, one of the sons of Noah, okay, who himself was also considered cursed in the Old Testament. So again, these types of, again, ancient myths are something that is continually used as an excuse without any kind of deeper thought as to the human condition itself. Okay, so again, this is still kind of the tip of the iceberg, and there's tons and tons of psychology that can be unpacked here, but we really only have time to scratch the surface with this. And again, the other key feature here too, of course, is that if we're going to latch on to this idea, even individuals who are eventually freed, they're still deemed socially and intellectually inferior to whites, okay, whether or not they live in the North or the South. And it's another thing too to keep in mind that just because an individual lives in the North, right, a white individual, say, It does not mean that just because they don't practice slavery, it doesn't mean that they're not racist, okay, or that they don't harbor prejudice against people of color. Okay, and that's still something, again, that we see even into the modern era. And this is another thing too, that when people start to look at the again, trying to compare Western culture with traditional African tribal cultures, during this time period, people are constantly trying to lord this idea of civilization and progress and stuff in the Western sense, and trying to lord it over people who have not gone through this type of development. Okay, and to basically say that these individuals are no better than children intellectually somehow because they have a culture that's vastly different from ours, and some of them even go so far as to dehumanize them down to the role of animals. Okay, Rudyard Kipling, who is very well known for writing the Jungle Book, okay, says in a poem that he calls the white man's burden, he refers to them as part devil, part child. Okay? So this is a mindset that, again, is not necessarily altogether divorced from slavery. Okay, once slavery goes away, it doesn't mean that this mindset goes away. Okay? So it's something that's very difficult to confront, but it's something that is still very heavily embedded. And again, in many cases, unfortunately, even into the modern era. And we've talked already about the concept of benevolent paternalism, right? This idea that somehow slaves are not going to be able to provide for themselves or for their families if they are freed. And so again, this gets used as another form of excuse, right? Why we keep people in bondage is we are somehow doing them a favor, okay? And by giving them, the barest minimum, again, sometimes not even that, when it comes to food and shelter and so forth, we're somehow helping them. Like we're somehow getting engaged in a charitable cause by doing this. And of course, deep down at its core level, right, the ultimate goal of slavery here is to turn a profit, okay? Profit specifically through the cotton industry, overwhelmingly above and beyond everything else, okay? And for whites living in the South in particular, the fastest road to social privilege, to gaining status, to gaining wealth, is through the slave trade. Okay, through the buying and selling of slaves to be used, again, through the cotton industry in particular. In the 1850s, the average value for an African slave is considered to be about $1,000 a head. Okay, this is again still roughly, again, a decade or so before the Civil War actually begins. And it's a very, again, it's a very profitable business in terms of monetary value, but again, at what cost? In 1790, if we go back a little bit further here, it's estimated that there's fewer than 700,000 enslaved African Americans living in the country. Okay, by 1830, the number rises to 2 million. Okay, and by 1860, it's 4 million. Okay? By the time we actually get around to the 13th Amendment and the Emancipation Proclamation, when all that comes to fruition and slaves are finally emancipated, we have about 4 million people on estimate, okay, that are actually freed. Okay. Now, when it comes to the keeping the system in perpetual motion here in the slave states, there are certain slave codes that are present, right? Certain laws that are put into action here to dictate, quite often, more often than not, really, as guidelines more so than actual laws for how slaves are going to be treated. Some of them are universal and some of them vary from state to state, but we'll cover just a few here. By and large, slaves are not allowed to leave the owner's land or household without permission. Okay, this is something that you will run into in almost every single instance, keeping them on a leash, whether metaphorically or literally speaking. Many of them are not allowed to stay out after dark without some sort of an identification pass. And in this case, it's considered a slave badge. Okay, this is something akin to a military dog tag that would be worn either around the neck or pinned to the clothing. Okay, and you see a few examples over here on the right-hand side. The top one says servant. This is from the year 1801. One to the right of it here says Fisher. This is from 1814. And one from 1861 at the bottom says porter, like a baggage porter, someone who carries luggage. And each one of these, you see a city attached to the top. The one at the bottom is Charleston. This is a port city in South Carolina, right? This is kind of the major hub of the slave trade. So this would have been a slave living in a major city. Let's see here. The one above it, of course, is also Charleston. Again, a fisher living in a coastal city makes sense. And I believe the top one is also from Charleston as well. Okay, so sometimes it would say specifically what city they came from. And again, most of the time it would be pinned to their clothing so that they would not be able to take it off very easily. They're not allowed to testify in court, and specifically not against whites. They're not allowed to legally marry. And they're not allowed to own firearms in most cases. And they cannot hit a white man even when it comes to self-defense. Okay, and we'll talk about one or two specific cases where this ends up backfiring quite literally in some instances here in just a little while. Now, when we talk about individuals who are not enslaved, right, and this happens most often in the North where people receive some sort of manumission or emancipation, they're referred to as free persons of color. And they have a few more freedoms than people who are enslaved, but not by much. Okay? They can enter into contracts of some kind, right, whether employment contracts or marriage contracts. Okay? They are allowed to marry legally. They can own a certain amount of property of their own, and this does include slaves. Okay, and it's not without precedent that that some African Americans, once they are emancipated, end up buying slaves of their own. Okay, because again, this is the status symbol, right? In certain parts of the country. Okay, it's considered, unfortunately, a universal one in many states during this period in time. They can pass on property to their children. Okay, it's not going to be confiscated by a slave owner. But they still have limitations. Okay, they still cannot vote in most states, right? And that really doesn't get overturned on an official capacity until we get to the 14th Amendment, okay, which happens after the Civil War. They cannot own weapons in many cases. Okay? And again, this ends up becoming a much bigger problem, especially for free persons of color who live in the South. Okay? And really for anybody who lives anywhere in the country, right? For protection, if nothing else. But also, if you live on a farm and you have to hunt in order to feed your family, right? If you don't have a gun, if you're not able to buy or keep one, it limits you quite a bit. They cannot attend white church services either. This is another key feature specifically in the South, not so much in the North, but many church services in the South begin to have segregated services, or they have entirely white churches compared to entirely black churches. Okay? And in some cases, white supremacy is preached directly from the pulpit. They cannot still testify against whites in court. Okay? There is still, the key feature of the Jim Crow era, which ends up occurring during Reconstruction and continuing well into the 30s and 40s. They cannot leave the state, okay, in many cases, right, without some sort of permission at best. And in some cases, in places like South Carolina, they have to simply pay an annual tax just for being black. And after 1823, in some cases, they are required to have a white guardian of some sort, right, like a chaperone, to vouch for them, essentially, right, so that they are not, mistaken for someone who is an escaped slave. Okay? And they have to carry an ID card or sometimes even a badge saying that they are free, right, like this one up here you see at the top right. Again, not too dissimilar from the badges for individuals who are slaves. Okay, this one just simply says free at the top. Right, kind of around this bell-shaped relief. And again, some are able to purchase their own freedom, right? If you live in a port city and you are a slave, chances are you have an owner who allows you to perhaps work in an alternative capacity, right, during your off hours, right? If you have a certain day of the week where you don't have to work, sometimes you can go and work at the docks, you can be hired out to someone else, and in many cases you are allowed to keep your own wages from that, okay? And if you save up over time, sometimes you are allowed to purchase your own freedom. And some are simply granted manumission. Okay, manumission is kind of a sponsored payment for freedom, right? Someone might come along and purchase your freedom for you. By 1860, it's estimated that about 250,000 freed slaves live in slave states, most of them living around coastal cities, okay? Because the further away from a city you get, the more in danger you are likely to be. Okay, it's far more likely that you will be mistaken for someone who is an escaped slave, or sometimes, quite often, you will even have slave owners who will simply round up whoever they can find. And again, it's your word against theirs if you were captured. Okay, so this is an extremely damning situation to be in. And individuals who are free persons of color living in coastal cities usually work as skilled laborers. Okay, they've been apprenticed out to someone perhaps as a tailor, a cobbler, a carpenter, a barrel maker, a painter, a blacksmith, whatever the case may be. And if you're a woman, again, you were typically put into kind of this pigeonholed household services type role, okay, working as a laundress, a seamstress, a house servant, perhaps a midwife. And a term here that is potentially incendiary, okay, I use this very carefully here, is a term called mulatto. Okay, and this is a term that today is considered largely a pejorative term. Okay, it's something that is been largely out of use for quite a while because it is potentially offensive. Okay, so again, I don't use this in any way to offend anyone, but this is an older, more archaic term for people of mixed ethnicity, right? For people who perhaps had a black mother and a white father. Okay, these are typically individuals who whose parents, one or more parents, were slaves. Okay, and they are usually the product of a union between a slave owner and a female slave, more often than not. Now, in the 1860 census, it's estimated that there are over 400,000 of these individuals living in the United States, and this is largely an understated number. Okay, again, census takers during this time period did not have adequate access to specific numbers. Sometimes they had to estimate what was actually present. And one particular individual that we can refer to here, just as a case study, is an individual named William Ellison. Okay, he was considered the wealthiest freedman living in the South at this time. Okay, he was liberated in 1816 and actually began his own business building and making cotton gins. Okay, and again, cotton gins at this point were a relatively new invention, even around the time that he was freed. Okay, they were invented only the time when he was about 3 years old. And he becomes one such individual who actually becomes extremely wealthy off this. Okay? He ends up owning a 900-acre plantation and owns more than 60 slaves. Okay? So he would have been part of the top roughly 10% of individuals living in the South who had quite a bit of wealth. Now, if we go back a little bit in the 1830 census, it's estimated that about 3.7 thousand free blacks living in the South owned about 12.76 thousand slaves. Okay, so it's a large disparity of the number of individuals who actually own slaves who are or former slaves themselves versus individuals who, again, might never own slaves and might never get out of slavery. Okay, but this is, again, a contingency that we don't often think of when we get the image of slavery in the South. We don't imagine blacks owning blacks in the South, but it was an actual reality. And well after the Civil War ends up occurring, there is still a very large contingency of wealthy African Americans living in the South. And the most horrible and monstrous aspect of this is, in many cases, a lot of them end up buying or inheriting members of their own families. Okay, so if you are, again, the product of a union between a white slave owner and a black slave mother, and you are, acknowledged by the slave owner, if you are granted a certain amount of wealth, if you were raised as part of the family, again, this is a rare occurrence. But if this ends up occurring, you might end up even inheriting your own mother in many cases, your brothers and sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, whatever the case may be. Now, when it comes to the actual slave trade itself, okay, the process for how slaves are bought and sold at market, we can get into a little bit of detail here. There is actually a rapid increase in the slave population in the early 19th century, even after Thomas Jefferson officially outlaws it in 1807, specifically due to the fact that slaves are being born more often in captivity. Okay, this is a self-sustaining population now. Okay, so many have been brought over, and in many cases are actually being purchased for the sole purpose of breeding in some cases, much like, again, livestock, as horrible as it sounds. And again, many slave women are giving birth in captivity, and they are essentially adding to the wealth of their owners, right? Every child that is born and is allowed to survive is able to, again, add to their owner's wealth. Okay, so again, this is it's very difficult to imagine and even to speak about human beings in this regard, but this was the goal and the mindset of individuals engaging in this. And again, even though the African slave trade is outlawed in North America in 1807, it doesn't mean that it stops. Okay, the trade itself in the country is allowed to continue. Slave populations are booming at this point in the country, and there is still plenty of smuggling occurring. Okay, just because people are not being brought over more active during this time, it doesn't mean that they're not being smuggled into the country anyway. Okay, and it doesn't mean that sales are not occurring under the table, so to speak. By 1820, it's estimated that over 80% of slaves living in America are born in the country. And from 1800 until 1860, right, the dawn of the Civil War, we have the price of slaves quadrupling due to the cotton industry. Okay, so again, it's estimated around 1850 they were about $1,000 a head. It ends up increasing a little bit more. Forgive me, I don't know the exact number by the time we get to the actual 1860s. Okay, but it seems to have plateaued by that point. And every single southern city, major cities that there are, or few that there were, still had a slave market, at least one in each individual city. And in some cases, like New Orleans, which I believe had more than 20, right? And newcomers, the process here is that they would be bathed and groomed. In some cases, if they were somehow, emaciated somehow, they would go through a conditioning phase where they would be quote unquote fattened up. Again, this is much in the same way that an individual might try to sell livestock, right? They try to, make the make the commodity presentable. As horrible as it sounds to talk about it this way. And once they are inspected in the public eye, right, much like the image you see in the background here, they are deemed either prime rate or second rate. Again, just like you would see being done with meat somehow. And the preferred demographic for a slave at this period in time was between the ages of 16 and 25, single with no families. Okay? And this is a horrible thing to even imagine, but individuals who were taken from their own home countries, again, whether they were prisoners of war, right, taken and purchased from other tribes, or simply if a village was raided by slave traders, right? In many cases, people would have been separated from their families anyway. One particular individual who has become much more celebrated in recent years is Solomon Northup, the man who wrote the book 12 Years a Slave. And he refers to the process here and says that scars on a slave's back are considered evidence of a rebellious or unruly spirit and hurt his chances for sale. Okay, so if you were a quarrelsome individual, right, if you did not go quietly, okay, if you fought, right, to get there, and you wound up with wounds of some sort, quite often it would either hurt your chances of being sold, which doesn't sound as horrible, right? If you can avoid getting purchased by someone, right? It sounds like a way out, but in many cases it means you would be sold to someone who is a much more brutal owner. Okay, someone who is more apt to beat their own slaves and who is not too dissuaded by that appearance. Okay, so if you have a cleaner appearance, it might mean that you were purchased by someone who perhaps has a gentler demeanor, right, in comparison to others. And again, women in particular are targeted more often than not as sexual objects, okay, whether for the purposes of breeding with other slaves or for sexual favors by a slave owner. The only two states in the Union that prohibit the separation of young children, okay, from their mothers, that is to say children younger than the age of 10, were Louisiana and Alabama, but only from 1850. Okay, so and this specifically has to do with some slave codes being updated over time. But all states did allow for the separation of spouses if you came to the situation married to someone else, and of course the separation of family members, right? Brothers and sisters, parents, grandparents, etc. Now, depending on where you are in the country, whether you live in a rural area, whether you lived in a city, the experiences of slaves tend to vary very greatly here. Okay? And it also depends on owner temperament as well. Okay, not all slave owners were as horribly brutal, okay, as some of them were. Okay? We know about the specific examples of the horrific ones, but not exhaustively. Okay, there are many cases that go completely unreported. The majority of slaves living in the South were considered field hands, male and female. These are individuals like you see the ones in the background here, right? Individuals who were manual laborers working in the fields, working in work gangs somehow, and were usually supervised by either a white overseer and or a black driver. And the daily toll was to work from sunrise to sunset 6 days a week. Okay, the seventh day was typically set aside as part of an ostensibly Christian practice to allow people a day off. And some individuals ended up working nights anyway, right? Whether ginning cotton, grinding sugarcane or corn, and sometimes this was part of their workload. Okay, it wasn't always something that they did voluntarily or for extra money. Okay, because quite often, if you lived on a plantation, you were not allowed to keep wages of any kind. And women typically worked in the fields all day and did housework at night. Okay, whether that means they came in and did work in the actual plantation owner's house or in their own houses. And the seventh day, this day off, was typically used to hunt, to fish, to tend a garden if they were allowed to do so, and to practice some form of recreation when and where they could. And again, some were hired out to other planters, to merchants, in some cases churches, to clean them, to other businesses of some kind. And again, they were not always allowed to keep wages. Okay, sometimes it was done as a service by one slave owner to someone who did not have a slave and needed extra help. And again, some were allowed to work on holidays or Sundays to earn their own money, again, if they were allowed to do so. One key feature of living on a plantation is when the harvest season came around, something called a push system was employed. Okay? And this basically says that each slave who worked on the plantation, right, was typically assigned to work in the fields for at least one day, if not several days, and was assigned a daily quota of cotton to be picked. And if they did not meet that quota, they would be met with really harsh repercussions, right? Quite often a whipping of some sort. And again, if you were considered more trustworthy, if you were perhaps part of an older contingency, right? Typically, if you were female, more often than not, you might be considered a house slave, which means that you worked as a servant directly in the planter's home. And if you were a woman in particular, you would be employed as a cook, a nurse, a maid, a nanny. Sometimes you would be there to, help dress the plantation mistress in the morning, draw her bath, bathe her children, that sort of thing. If you were a plantation owner himself, right, you might simply have a butler of some sort. You might have a maid servant of some kind. And plantation slaves were typically housed in a wooden shack of some kind, right? Maybe only a one-room shack, sometimes two rooms if it were part of a larger family, with dirt floors. If you were a more wealthy planter, you might invest in brick houses for your slaves, but quite often they lived in very drafty shacks. Beds were considered a very, very high luxury. Okay, if you lived with a wealthy planter who actually treated their slaves well, you might get a bed. Okay, but typically it would be a very thin, cheap blanket. When it comes to clothing, it would be very cheap linen or cotton clothing given to individuals twice a year. Okay, and you would typically only wear the set of clothes you had on your back was typically what you would wear 6 months out of the year. Okay, and once those clothes began to rot and fall off, you might be given a second pair. Shoes, however, are only provided in winter more often than not, okay, because shoes at this point in time were expensive, and it was something that slave owners did not invest in. The typical food allotment, whether it was on a weekly basis or a monthly basis, was some measure of cornmeal and pork. So it would be something that would sometimes be salted meat that would be allowed to be kept for a longer period of time, right? Something akin to a jerky type situation, okay, was quite often not fresh meat. And cornmeal itself would be something that would last a certain amount of time, right? You would have a very small ration that you would have to, again, allot for yourself for a certain amount of time, right? Have to make it last. And some slaves were skilled workers, as I've said before, and this primarily occurred in cities. Okay? So again, individuals who worked at a specific discipline, as a carpenter, blacksmith, cooper, barrel maker, something along those lines. And they often had a better quality of life than plantation slaves, okay? Because they lived in a city, they had better access to certain commodities. They might be able to keep their own wages and buy their own clothing. And there's a greater sense of mobility and freedom. Okay, if you were a slave living in a city, okay, you would have the ability to perhaps gain a little bit more trust. You couldn't just disappear into the wilderness or try to run away from a plantation. And again, most of the time, if you were an individual who was able to work a second job, you were able to keep some of your own earned wages. In 1850, the average life expectancy for a slave, really no matter where, was about the age of 36. This was probably a little bit lower in a plantation setting, just because, again, you might end up, dying from a brutal whipping, from infection, from an accident of some kind. There's all kinds of hazards involved here. And the average age for whites was about 40. Okay, so even still, whites were not living much longer. The one number that is rather startling is estimated to be about 50% of all slave babies died in their first year. Okay, and this is because of the lack of hygiene, the lack of any kind of antiseptic methods. Okay, and childbirth itself was a very arduous process. Okay, many women ended up dying in childbirth, as did their babies. Okay? And this number is considered to be more than twice the infant mortality rate of whites. Now, the most horrible aspect of all this, of course, is the violent aspect. This is some of the stuff that's the more difficult information to discuss. Brutal treatment was something that many slaves had to look forward to. The most common form of punishment, of course, is whipping. Okay, this could occur for even the slightest offenses. Okay, there's not really a guarantee that you're going to get anything less than this. The individual that you see in the image on the far right here is a planter from Louisiana named Bennett Barrow. He was a very notorious slave owner, known for whipping a slave approximately every 4 days. Okay, and sometimes he did it for the sheer entertainment of it. He believed he was a very sadistic individual. He was a dog breeder, okay, and he would actually end up using his form of business here to actually torment his slaves. If you are interested in researching this type of information, okay, if you're using it for a research paper or something along those lines, I don't try to advertise this type of thing just for the sheer shock value of it or anything like that. But his diaries are available in a transcribed form on the internet. Okay, so if you want to know the brutality, you can read about it. But he refers in some instances to various forms of torture, which you see here. I won't go into too much detail here just for the sake of honoring those who had to endure this. But again, used dogs quite often, ended up hunting slaves, brutally mistreating them. And quite often these types of punishments were done in a very public setting. Okay, this was not something done behind closed doors. Many slaves were stripped naked to humiliate them. If they were whipped, if they had open wounds, they would have salt or pebbles rubbed into them. Branding and mutilation were not uncommon either. Shackling and imprisonment, of course, is a very key feature of a lot of this. Some of them were simply shot. And in many cases, medieval torture devices were used. Okay? The collars that you see here were used as a way to ensure that an individual could not lie down to sleep. And if they attempted to, the iron spikes would end up being driven into their skin and cause all kinds of bodily harm. The image of the face mask that you see on the far right here, not too dissimilar to what we've already seen with the scold's bridle that we discussed a few chapters back, right? A form of punishment for talking out of turn. And the condition of women, in many cases, ends up becoming the worst of all treatment. Okay, simply because they are used as sexual devices as well as beasts of burden. Okay, and the trade in female slaves was considered profitable because of fertility. Many of them were again purchased simply for the sole purpose of breeding. And many slave women were actually given incentives for having multiple children. Okay? Again, they would be granted favors, food, extra clothing, in some cases money for doing this for a slave owner. And once the children are born, if they survive childbirth, quite often the women would be back in the fields within a day or two, right, after giving birth, with the children strapped to their backs. Okay? And there's actually one specific essay that deals with this that I remember reading in graduate school. It's very, very interesting, gets into a lot of the specifics about treatment of women, and it's not something that is to be taken lightly, but the essay is called "Some Could Suckle Over Their Shoulder." It's by an author named Jennifer Morgan. Okay? It's part of a larger anthology called New Studies in the History of American Slavery. And as the title suggests, many of these women would have so many children and they would breastfeed so often that in some cases they would be able to hold a child on their backs and would be able to literally suckle the child over their shoulder by simply lifting their breast up to the child's mouth. So this is again, it's a horrifying image in terms of the sheer exploitation of women, but it's something that deserves to be told. And slave women were expected to work in the same capacity as men. Okay, they were not necessarily granted special treatment because they were women. Okay, in terms of the workload that they were given. If you were a middle-aged woman and you had already gone through menopause, if you were past the childbearing age, in many cases you were given more work. Okay? You were not, part of your time was not allotted to childbearing. Okay? So you were sometimes just given more physical labor. Women who managed to get to an elderly age were referred to as grannies, and sometimes they would be employed more often as house slaves, right, as seamstresses or cooks, midwives or nurses. In many cases, they would even be looked up to as a healer or a folk doctor on the plantation. Okay, if someone would go to them with an injury, they might be able to provide an herbal remedy of some kind. And even in some cases, the plantation owners themselves would go to these grannies for these types of healings. Okay? If you had a plantation mistress, for example, who could not conceive, okay, in some cases she would go for some kind of a remedy for that. Or if a male plantation owner was impotent, same type of thing. And this is kind of where the agency of practicing an indigenous religion would come in. Okay, if this would be an area where someone might relax their standards. In some cases you would have plantation owners who insisted that all slaves would be converted to Christianity, but where this type of remedy would come into play, right, they might relax their standards a bit. And again, if you were a woman, there is a good chance you would be sexually abused or exploited at some point. One particular very horrible individual here that deserves to be discussed because of what happens to other individuals around him was actually a South Carolina congressman named James Henry Hammond. Okay? And he's known for carrying on multiple affairs with female slaves of his own, including several incestuous relationships with members of his own family. One of whom was a 12-year-old daughter of his, along with several nieces. And one other very specific case study that actually has been put into to book form in some cases, right? This has been studied quite a bit. Was a case that came in 1855 called the State of Missouri versus Celia, a slave. This is the only known image that we really have of Celia. She was a 14-year-old girl purchased in 1850 by a slave owner named Robert Newsom, and he purchased her specifically for sexual purposes. She was considered the first female slave that he ever purchased. He kept her as a mistress for a long time, and she ended up giving birth to two of his children. When he attempted to rape her at one point, when she was the age of 19, she actually fought back and managed to kill him in self-defense. After being tried and convicted by a jury of all white men, she was actually hanged at the age of 19. So this is, again, one particularly horrifying case study where the system is actively working against female slaves. Okay, but there is an actual book that was written as a case study about this, and it's called Celia, a Slave. It's written by an author named Melton McLaurin, if you're interested in reading about her further. Now, in slave communities, there is a much larger sense of community through the shared culture and through the shared experience of hardship. Okay, and again, it's worth noting too that individuals who were sold into slavery quite often came from several different specific cultural and tribal backgrounds. Okay, and many of them by this point were several generations removed from their culture of origin. Okay. But it's estimated there were about 50 different cultures and languages spoken by first-generation African slaves. Okay, so and many of them did not like each other. Okay, they had already been through multiple tribal warfare situations before they were even brought to the United States. So for them to go through all that and eventually bond in some cases over time speaks to the horrific conditions they were living in and really the human spirit. Okay, it's again something that's it's difficult to generalize about this sort of thing, obviously, and not something that's always allots it the amount of respect it deserves. But this is it cannot be overstated that these individuals went through so much and had to bind together. Anytime there was some kind of a meeting of some kind among slaves, that would typically have to be done in secret at night. Okay, and this was done simply to, not draw the attention of the slave owner, because a slave owner might look at this as a secret meeting plotting against them. Okay, and again, this was the common fear among the slave owners, that eventually slaves would end up arming themselves, conspiring against slave owners, rising up and killing them. Okay, and in some cases, this did happen. Okay, but quite often it was simply a way for individuals to relieve tension, to relieve the pressures of everyday life. Okay, and sometimes they would be able to drink if they can get their hands on alcohol, whether they distilled it themselves or simply stole it from their owners. There would be dancing, singing, storytelling, and this is where we get the introduction of a lot of traditional storytelling, like Brer Rabbit, for example. This is a character who is eventually, played off as eventually gets turned into a cartoon character in the largely lost Disney film, The Song of the South. Okay, this is a film that has been, largely pushed out of existence by Disney because it romanticized life in the antebellum South. Okay, it tried to show that slaves were happy and singing and that sort of thing. This is what has been the cause for controversy around the Splash Mountain ride at Disney World, because it still contains these characters and doesn't really give them the due that their origin material really espoused. The Anansi stories are another one. Anansi was a spider in West African myth. Okay, that was a sort of a trickster. Okay, and in many cases that was the case. Brer Rabbit is another example of this. The protagonist in a lot of these stories was a trickster who managed to get out of a dangerous situation and exact revenge because of their wit and cunning. Okay, this is something that is very much a daydream for a lot of African slaves living during this period. Okay? Being able to get out of this horrible situation, to outsmart their owners in some manner. And in many cases, the desire to get revenge for what has been done to them and their families. Religious spirituals, of course, are another thing that we see referenced time and time again. These are songs that are sung that in some cases contain double meanings of some kind. Okay, it's usually an expression of emotion, right, of anguish, of hardship, of a desire to get away from one's current situation. But again, in some cases, these were they contain coded messages. Okay, the song "Wade in the Water" is a message for how to avoid being captured by dogs, right, if you're running away. And the other songs include Gospel Train and Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. Okay, these contain references to the Underground Railroad, right? The series of safe houses and locations where you would be safe if you were running away from captivity. And if nothing else, they're a form of protest, right? And some cathartic relief from suffering. Okay, it's not something you could always engage in at all times, but the image of slaves singing in a field was a situation where they might be miserable. They're in the midst of suffering, in the middle of the heat, in the middle of the day. How else can they express themselves except by doing this? And of course, slave owners looked at this as a way of believing, oh, they're singing, they must be happy. So it's a way of expressing themselves without drawing negative attention. And even though marriage was outlawed in most cases, slaves were allowed to choose life partners and have families. Okay? And in some cases, if you were a black man in particular who had a family while in captivity and you took care of them, you were in some cases considered to be more responsible by your owner. Okay? And you might be given more responsibility, you might be given more freedoms, you might be allowed to work in a more high-end position. And when it comes to children, those who managed to survive infancy, they would be put to work as early as the age of 5 or 6, and perhaps even as young as 4, gathering firewood, picking cotton, scaring away crows in a field, and became full-time field hands by the time they reached 10 years old. And all members of slave communities typically referred to each other by family epithets. Okay, so the terms granny, sis, brother, father, mother, etc. The presence of Christianity in slave communities is something that is, again, has been looked at in a debatable sense because of whether or not it had a positive or negative impact. In many cases, it does have a very negative impact. The majority of Southerners at this point in time, whether they were white or black, were typically evangelical Protestants. Okay? They practiced some form of religion that at least mimicked this in some regard. Again, the Baptist and Methodist churches were the most common during this time period living in the South. And both of the religious doctrines of these two churches involve creating a quote-unquote kingdom of God on earth before the advent of a new millennium and the idea of a second coming, right? The idea that somehow Christ is going to return to earth at some point, and we need to, in some ways, purify the world, purify society, and purify ourselves before he returns, lest we be judged. Okay? And again, the presence of slavery, again, serves as a large form of cognitive dissonance in this. Okay? Northerners, for example, believed that Northerners who practiced Baptist or Methodist ideologies, that is, looked at slavery as being completely diametrically opposed to slavery. We are actually going to purify the world, we need to get rid of it. But if you lived in the South, you might end up, again, being like, the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, right? A minister who actually preached white supremacy from the pulpit. And there are a few pockets of Catholicism and Judaism that did exist in coastal cities. These were very uncommon, okay? And quite often faced a large amount of prejudice from Protestants living nearby. By the late 18th century, a lot of Northern Baptists and Methodists, again, began to openly condemn slavery as being a problem. Okay? And this is kind of where a lot of the abolitionist movements began to come into play. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next chapter. In these cases, blacks were welcomed into some congregations. Women were given important church roles. And by the 1830s, though, the criticism of slavery in the South is virtually gone. Okay? It takes a lot of very heavy push by the North to actually begin to insert these types of ideologies into the South, okay? Because the South put up quite a bit of barriers, okay, at the systemic level to prevent this from happening. And again, slavery in many cases was defended as being a divinely ordained system. Okay, in some cases, even in the New Testament of the Bible, individuals began to point to instances where major biblical figures, Christ included, if I'm not mistaken, gave guidelines for how to treat one's slaves. Okay, so they considered this to be, not a condemnation so much as an acceptance of slavery. And again, some biblical stories were utilized still to legitimize oppression. Okay, again, like we talked about already with the Old Testament curses and so forth, generational curses and so forth. And in some cases, religion was used as an intensifier for brutality. Okay? If you were a slave who was purchased by a very religious owner, you might see them be an extremely stringent individual, right? Someone who would not tolerate indigenous beliefs, would not tolerate folk remedies, would not tolerate the singing of certain spirituals because they were too close to pagan ideologies. They would and this would be a way of, even in some cases in the minds of slave owners anyway, of causing suppression of their own instincts. Okay, they might end up being more sexually ravenous in some cases because they had no other outlet for this. Now, speaking of indigenous religion and how it plays into all this, it was typically used as a form of protest among slaves. Again, some slaves were devout Christians. Okay, it's estimated that in 1860, about 20% of slaves joined Christian denominations, sometimes, again, at the behest of their owners. Okay, they would do it under threat of punishment. And Christianized slaves were considered to be more subdued and obedient by owners, right? If they still practiced their native religions or were allowed to do so, right, they might be more prone to rebellion in some fashion. And sometimes you would even have plantation preachers, right? Individuals who were slaves themselves who became preachers of a Christian tradition of some kind. And meanwhile, others would still practice some combination of African spiritualism or Caribbean spiritualism, and sometimes they would even incorporate Christian traditions into this. Okay, this is kind of where we get the combination of all these is where we get the voodoo and hoodoo practices. They would still identify with the Christian God, with Jesus and the saints, and with the Exodus story. Okay, the imagery used in the Exodus story is something that continued to be used well into the Civil Rights era. And of course, the stories in the Bible were meant to be used as an inspiration toward the poor and the oppressed. Abolitionists in particular began to use this to circulate this type of belief system. But many still held a lot of cultural beliefs that concern magic, the spirit world, blessings and curses, the ability to cure illness by the laying on of hands, whether it was to drive out evil spirits or through, magical intervention of some kind. And one particular form of religious practice is called obeah. Okay, this is a form of shamanism originating specifically in West Africa that's, again, very similar to voodoo. It involves curses, spirits, healing, the use of fetishes, okay, some kind of something similar to perhaps a voodoo doll of some kind, right? A black magic doll, quote unquote black magic. I should qualify that. Not necessarily considered black magic by those practicing it. And religious gatherings among slaves, again, were sometimes viewed as being subversive meetings, okay? Because if they gain enough understanding of the idea of removing themselves from bondage, right? The Exodus story in particular ends up being a big paradigm for this. Then they might come to the understanding that they are themselves in bondage and want to foment rebellion. And again, rebellion was not uncommon. Okay, this was, again, considered to be the worst nightmare of the slave owner. Okay, it was their worst fears come upon them. And this speaks to some sort of a subconscious, in some cases a fully conscious form of cognitive dissonance. Okay, the knowledge that what is going on here is fundamentally wrong. Okay, and whether individuals came to that realization or not during their lifetime, again, there's something deep down in the human condition. Unless you are completely a sociopath or even an active psychopath, it boils down to human empathy. And so some individuals had this fear based on this, and some simply knew that it was wrong but continued to practice it anyway. There's only 4 major recorded slave rebellions in the 19th century South. And again, others were no doubt, enacted. No doubt others were in practice here. But these are the 4 major ones that we know about. Okay? One in the year 1800 involved a man named Gabriel Prosset, and whether or not this, I believe this is an artist rendering of him. He was a plantation blacksmith who managed to organize a revolt involving hundreds of slaves. And before he could actually end up killing anyone or taking over anything, the whites of the plantation ended up discovering it and hanged Prosset among with 26 others. In 1811, there's another black overseer named Charles DeLond. He ended up leading a 2-day slave revolt at a sugarcane plantation near New Orleans, and the governor ended up intervening here. Over 100 slaves ended up being tortured and beheaded, actually, as a result. So again, this was a very public display of putting down a rebellion like this. In 1822, we have Denmark Vesey. He's a freed slave, in this case, who actually desired to lead Charleston's slave population in a mass murder of whites. Okay? And one of the slaves in his company actually ended up betraying him to other local whites, and Vesey and 34 others were executed. This also caused South Carolina to enter into much heavier slave restrictions. Again, Charleston was the epicenter of the slave trade in the South. And it also causes John C. Calhoun to abandon a lot of nationalism in favor of states' rights and in favor of sectionalist rifts. The most famous one probably, though, comes in 1831 in the form of Nat Turner. Okay? He was a black overseer and a preacher, okay? Two very uncommon combinations here. He ended up leading an insurrection in Southampton County, Virginia, managed to murder his owner's entire family, along with 57 other whites, over the course of 2 days. And he managed to briefly escape captivity before he was caught, and he was actually very brutally executed along with 20 other individuals. Now, in terms of sheer numbers, it's estimated that an average of about 50,000 slaves try to escape on an annual basis. Okay? In reality, only about 1,000 end up making it to freedom. Okay? So about 2% of what you would see try to escape end up making it. Okay? So the likelihood that you would end up actually escaping is very, very low. And some only did it temporarily. Okay, if a slave owner was perhaps a drunk or was given to violent mood swings, an individual might escape into the woods to hide for a day or two until tempers cooled, until an individual sobered up, and then would actually come back. And it baffles modern audiences to think that a slave owner would be baffled by individuals attempting to escape. Again, the whole mindset is that we are doing these people a favor by keeping them in captivity, and so why would they want to escape? Okay? So some people begin to actually, believe what they are using as an excuse. Okay? It's an extremely dangerous form of naivete by doing this. And this is a debatable thing. Your textbook claims that positive reinforcement was used more often than negative here. Again, for the large stereotypical and more common instances that we encounter here, negative reinforcement is by and large used more often. The difference here between the two in psychology, positive reinforcement is saying we will give you a reward for being good. Okay? Negative reinforcement says we will punish you for being bad. So again, I don't know every single instance in which, this type of reinforcement was used one way or another, but in most cases that I personally have encountered in study and research, negative reinforcement tends to be the most popular version. Okay, so this is a debatable thing, depending on what records we have. And there's all kinds of other ways that slaves managed to protest their conditions. Okay? They could fake an illness. They could steal or break tools to slow down the process. They could destroy crops if they really had it out for their owners and didn't really fear, being punished. They could slaughter and eat livestock. They could cause livestock to simply disappear and claim that it had run off, okay, if they didn't have adequate food, and simply not working. Okay, they could lay down and actually try to take a nap during the day. Okay, and again, the amount of punishment that would go along with this would be extremely severe. Okay, so it speaks to the desperation and the mindset of saying, what else do I have to lose? So taking all this into consideration, when we talk about the South, the further western expansion that we see happening in the first half of the 19th century leads to greater competition between the North and the South. And the South has all of this, large institution of slavery involved in moving westward. Okay? This would involve the exportation of this entire system to the West. And so it begs the question in the Northern mindset, do we want to allow this type of situation to occur more and more out west? Are these new territories that we acquire when they become states, are they going to be slave states or free states? And again, the South has a lot of influence because of the cotton industry. It accumulates and controls so much of the wealth through it. Okay, and so to deny it this is, in some cases, to commit political suicide. And so it's fundamental to economic growth, again, quite often at the expense of many, many thousands of human lives. And the nullification crisis that we've already seen in 1832 speaks to the resentment that the South has for the North, okay, believing that whatever rights it believes it has are being infringed upon, and it's going to remain stubborn and obstinate as much as it possibly can when the North tries to exert its influence. And so in the 1850s, on the dawn of the Civil War, right, a decade out from it, the Southerners begin to envision that the South is going to be populated entirely by slave owners. Okay? And if we continue to expand westward, then this Missouri Compromise that we've already discussed is going to continue all the way out west. Okay? So their entire image, if we get to the other side of the continent here, is to have the entirety of the South, including the Southwest, populated by slave owners. But ultimately, the defiant attitude of the South, and it's this really prickly sense of personal honor that it exercises here, is what ends up getting us involved in civil war. Okay? While individuals try time and time again to say that the war was fought over states' rights versus the federal government trying to intervene, the loophole here and the fine print is that the states' rights that are trying to continue here is the right of the states to continue practicing a very brutal system in the image of slavery. Okay? So it does boil down to slavery at its very core. Okay? Despite what anyone will tell you, the Civil War will be fought over slavery.